So if you're disposed to believe that you're in a state, if you're in a conscious state, insofar as you're rational, then an introspective belief is just a belief that is the manifestation of that disposition. Moreover, if it's a manifestation of a rational disposition, then in an intuitive sense, it'll be a reasonable or rational belief. And if it's a belief that amounts to knowledge, then that's what introspective knowledge is. And so that's sort of broadly speaking the picture.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Daniel Stoljar. He is Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University, and his work is focused on philosophy of mind, language, metaethics, metaphysics, and metaphilosophy, subsequent progress, and so on. His books include Ignorance and Imagination, Physicalism, Philosophical Progress in Defense of Reasonable Optimism, What is Consciousness? A Debate, written with Amy Kind, and his new book, which we'll be covering today, The Introspection Principle, Rationalism about Knowledge of Consciousness. Anyway, yeah, feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Stoljar.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Awesome. So yeah, as I said, we're gonna focus today on your new book, The Introspection Principle, Rationalism about Knowledge of Consciousness, and perhaps to start, maybe we should get some idea of what the target phenomenon is. Can you talk a bit more about what introspection is, at least in some like pre-theoretic sense, before we start trying to give accounts of it?
Sure. Well, the notion of introspection can be understood in lots of different ways, and it's one of these words that flies around a lot, and different people in philosophy and in related parts of science use it in slightly different ways. In the book, I use it basically to name what seems to be a sort of distinctive way that we come to know that we're in conscious states when we do. So if you are in a conscious state, like if you have a pain in your foot, or you perceive a cat in front of you or something, and you think of those states as conscious, then on the face of it, it looks as if you can come to know that you're in those states. But the way in which you come to know this doesn't fit sort of common models that you might have for how to come to know such facts. So we don't seem to know them by perception, at least not in any usual sense. It's not perception seems to tell us about stuff in our local environment. But that we are in certain kinds of conscious states doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that perception tells us about. And nor does it seem to be true that we come to know it by inference. So if we're thinking about other people, why they're in conscious states, then you'd think, okay, we come to know that by inference, or perhaps by some mixture of perception and inference or something, at least in a very typical case. But at least in our own case, I seem to be able to know that I can perceive a cat or have a pain in my foot or something without going through that kind of inferential procedure on the face of it. And so then there seems to be some distinctive way in which we can come to know that we're in conscious states. And introspection, in the way that I use the term, is just a name for that distinctive way. So that in a way, the point is to use the word without prejudice, So obviously the word has a lot of connotations. It's got, an inside bit with the word intro, and a perceptual bit with the word spect, like spectacles. But I don't use it in that way. I just mean the name for this apparently distinctive way that we can come to know this thing. We have an apparently distinctive source of knowledge with respect to our own conscious states. And the issue is, what is that and how does it work? And is there such a thing? There are people, of course, who've said there's nothing like that, but that's okay. But I'm interested in that. That's the sort of target phenomenon, really.
Good. Yeah, great. That's a good start. And you mentioned a couple of the alternatives, well, including, like I said, the mediativist worry that you cover at some length in the book. One being, well, maybe it's a sort of perception, or maybe it's a sort of inference. And the perceptual style account, I mean, that might seem kind of intuitive. Like, okay, we have perceptions of the outside world, for example, with vision and other, we have other sensory modalities that enable that. And maybe introspection is a sort of perception of the inner world, or some aspects of our mental life, for example. So, yeah, I mean, why not think of introspection as something like that? What do you think?
Yeah, so I guess the I guess for me, the crucial issue there is the phrase, something like that. That phrase picks out lots and lots of different kind of phenomena. So our ordinary thinking about perception there's lots of different kinds of things that you might call perception. The first thing I'd want to say about that is there's obviously something right about any kind of perceptual model or inner sense model, as it's typically called. And that is that, for example, we do talk about introspection in a perceptual way. The very word, as we just noticed, has some perceptual element sort of in it to some degree. And that's probably something that's kind of inevitable. We're not going to get away from that kind of language. I don't take that terribly seriously as a theory about its underlying nature. For one reason, we use perceptual language all over the place. In lots of things, we sort of look into the past and we have insight into social situations, and we use perceptual language like this, just routinely. And we don't sort of think that there's some literal, squinting at the past, or sort of you don't put on your binoculars and figure out what a social situation is. That's not what we have in mind when we use phrases like that. So the mere fact that we use the label perceptual or words that are perceptual when describing the phenomenon doesn't move me all that much, though it's an interesting fact, and also it's one which I suspect we can't get away from. But having said that, there are people who think that the way that we talk about it in that respect should be taken, seriously, theoretically seriously, as an account of what it is that we're doing. And so that, for example, those people in that camp basically think, well, when you take a paradigmatic case, when you perceive an object in front of you, there's some relation that you bear to this object. The relation affords you, plays a certain kind of role. It allows you to form certain beliefs or to interact with the object in a particular way. And taken completely literally, the idea would be that your relation to your own conscious states is exactly the same as that. That, just as I can see, my phone in front of me and, interact with it in a kind of perceptual or visual way, well, there's my seeing of the phone. That's a different sort of phenomenon. And I can interact with that in exactly the same way. That would be a very, very flat-footed, straightforward version of the inner sense view. And I guess that kind of view seems not that plausible to me, mainly because it just doesn't seem that our interaction with these two things are the same. That it's sort of, in the case of, the phone, it has, my interaction with it seems to have certain properties. I can track it over time. I can distinguish it from other things. I seem to attribute certain kinds of intrinsic properties to it, like its color and shape and so forth. And I can attend to it in a very straightforward way if I want. Whereas conscious states, the state of being in a conscious, consciously feeling a certain way or consciously believing something, they don't seem to quite fit that model. So I guess I don't want to think about it in that way. So at least the most sort of flat-footed version of the inner sense view doesn't look that plausible. Of course, a lot of people will say, yeah, that's true, but I want to say that it's somehow like perception in some way. And of course, I agree with that. It is in some ways like perception. It's some way that we come to know certain things, and the things that we come to know are contingent, like it's a contingent fact that my phone is on the desk and I can come to know that fact by perception. Likewise, it might be a contingent fact that I'm perceiving a phone and I can come to know that by introspection. So there are, of course, some deep similarities. But I guess I think that if you just assert that it's similar, well, you haven't really said anything. You want to say something more than that. So that's one way of thinking about the issues about the inner sense model. There's a philosopher who I
Shoemaker
am reacting to a lot in this book, and that's Sidney Shoemaker. And one of Shoemaker's kind of interventions in the philosophy of introspection was to basically give a kind of critical analysis of the inner sense theory that is much more detailed than the one I just gave you. It sort of distinguishes different versions of them and different versions of the account, and shows how you could distinguish various more and gives various criticisms of it. And in the book, I sort of summarize and endorse those criticisms. But yeah, so those are the reasons for thinking that the perceptual model in the sort of straightforward sense isn't right.
Good. Yeah. So I thought maybe I bring up one of the criticisms that Shoemaker brings up and ask us something about that, because one of those criticisms is that against the sort of object perceptual model, and he argues that, well, there's just not a sort of mental object that we introspect in this way, and so the object perceptual model is false. I mean, that's a rough characterization, but it sounds inference kind of like that. And I was wondering, what if someone responded? I mean, you can expand more on this response if you feel, but what if someone responded that, well, maybe there is a mental thing that is the object of perception. It's some sort of conscious state or something like that. Why couldn't that sort of fit the bill? Yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, it's it's a sort of complicated situation. So there's lots of different kinds of conscious states. We could be talking about a conscious belief or a conscious perception or sensation or something. In the case of sensations, I think people think that the inner sense model is particularly plausible because they think, well, when you feel a certain sensation, like a sensation in your foot, the sensation seems to us to be some sort of object, maybe a bit like my phone, and that I can attend to it and come to know things about it by attending to it and so forth. There's a lot of things to say about that sort of case. One thing, very straightforward thing to say, is that in the case of sensation, you need to distinguish sensation in the sense of something in your foot which you attend to, and sensation in the sense of a state that you're in, which you could be in even if you didn't have a foot. You could still sort of feel as if you had a pain in your foot, and that state, it's harder to see how we could attend to that state, even though we could attend to the thing that's apparently in the foot. So we want to draw a distinction there between the state, the sensory state that you're in, and the sort of, which you might think of as the object of the state. And it's true that we might attend to the object of the state and call it a sensation, but that's not the thing that we're talking about. We're talking about a psychological state that you're in. And that, it's less clear to think of it as something that you could attend to. In fact, there are famous kind of arguments here, sometimes called transparency arguments or diaphanousness arguments, which are supposed to get you to believe that when you actually think about it, you don't really attend to the state, you attend to something else, maybe the content of the state or something of that sort. And so those are arguments that basically, in effect, are on a collision course with the perceptual model. Having said that, there are lots of people who these days, I mean, Shoemaker was writing some time ago, and so since he wrote, there have been various developments, and one development is for people to endorse what looks really like a kind of perceptual model, but is supposed to be different enough from any of the versions that he criticized to avoid the criticisms. And that's the most common one is often called the Acquaintance view or the inner awareness view or something of that sort. And those people who hold that view tend to think that what I just said is mistaken. They say, no, in your inner conscious state, it has to be that you're acquainted with the state, and that relation of acquaintance doesn't meet all of the properties that we might associate with perception, but it meets enough, or it just does, and so that's a kind of, in a sense, model, or at least you could certainly interpret it that way if you wanted to.
Good, yeah, and we'll come to the acquaintance proposal a bit more later. Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I was thinking, I think there's something sort of plausible about this where, okay, we consider the pain state, and not the pain sort of, we're picking out some sort of affliction in the foot perhaps, but something that is a sort of conscious state. I'm not sure that is most accurate to talk about conscious states as things per se that could stand in these sorts of relations. Maybe I prefer a sort of adverbial account of these sort of phenomenal states. I count as being in a conscious state of a certain sort, but there's not an object that is that state, if that makes sense. Is that something that seems plausible to you, or what do you think about that?
Well, the issue about that's an issue about the nature of I take that to be an issue about the nature of the states, exactly.
Right.
Like, for example, the other states that we're in, do they have certain kind of do they have a certain kind of intentional structure? So that means do they represent things, or when you're in them, do you represent things? And if so, how does that work? What exactly is the content of the representation, etc.? So those are all those issues. And adverbialism is a kind of proposal along those lines, a kind of deflationary proposal that says that, all that's true is that you feel a certain way. It's not true that you feel something. There isn't something that you feel. And or that when you perceive a cat, what's true is that you perceive in a certain way, sort of on the model of, when you run quickly or slowly. So when you perceive a cat just qualifies some way that you perceive. And those are interesting issues. They're not issues that interact terribly much with the issues that I talk about in the book, because no matter what the nature of perceptual states are, obviously in the philosophy of perception, there are lots of proposals about what perceptual states are, or what states of sensations are, if we kind of assimilate them to perceptual states. And adverbialism is one such proposal. There's a whole range of others. And in my case, I don't say very much about that. I do assume that states, in the book, I do assume that states have a certain kind of content. And so you might think, well, the adverbialist is going to get off the bus right there. But even that isn't so clear, actually, because unfortunately, there's lots of different kinds of adverbialism. There are very simple kinds that most of us think can't possibly be true. And then there are much more complex kinds which look kind of as if they would accommodate the idea that mental states have content. So I don't actually go into adverbialism very much, but it's certainly a potential position. Adverbialism by itself is a thesis about what perceptual states or what conscious states are. It's not so much a thesis about how we might come to know that we're in them, which is the issue that I'm focusing on.
True, yeah. It's sort of tangential, I suppose, but I felt like asking about that. But then, okay, we covered the inner perception stuff. Maybe briefly, if you want, comment on the view about introspection as a sort of inference. Maybe it's some sort of process of inferring things about ourselves. And in particular, I mean, sometimes when we introspect, we're inferring. So why would you think that sort of account isn't going to work across the board? If that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's certainly true that sometimes you can draw inferences, like you can think of yourself as if you were a third party, Richard Moran calls that the theoretical stance on yourself. So when you're thinking about other people, you presumably, maybe this isn't, even in the case of other people, of course, there are controversies, but to a first approximation, what happens is as I said before, you come to know that other people, are in conscious states by perceiving the way they behave and then drawing an inference that they must be in some state. And occasionally you can think of yourself in that way. And not necessarily deliberately. You might just see someone who is in fact you and attribute certain states to yourself. But also, even deliberately, you might think of yourself as a person just like any other, and then attribute states to yourself. So I think none of us want to deny that. The point is that to say that at least on the face of it, there's an alternative way to proceed here. We have a sort of alternative way of finding out that you're in a conscious state, and that's a kind of an assumption, because what we're doing is basically making an assumption that there is such a way, and then the project is to try to figure out what that is. Now, some people, of course, will deny that, including some pretty famous people. I talk about, there's a well-known argument by Dretske, for example, that I think has the consequence that couldn't possibly be true. And, further back, there are people like Gilbert Ryle who held views which are effectively say, no, there's just no distinctive way that we come to know these things. So I'm sort of more or less assuming that there is, and then theorizing about it, which is a sort of typical way to proceed. You kind of provisionally assume that there are a sort of bunch of facts, and then you figure out what the nature of those things are. So that's sort of how I'm proceeding in this case. So I think the reason for thinking that an inferentialist approach can't quite be right is roughly just that we have just lots of examples where we come to know certain things, and it just doesn't seem like you're performing a certain kind of inference and coming to know it. Of course, it's difficult. The terminology here is a bit difficult because, take the notion of an inference can be understood in various ways. It can be understood as, forming a belief on the basis of some other belief or some other item of knowledge that you have. And it can also be understood in a much more expansive way where it just means pretty much any psychological process from one thing to another. So that, in that sense, for example, you might think of the visual system as performing certain kinds of inferences, or AI systems as performing certain kinds of inferences. And that's perfectly fine. I don't object to that use of the word inference. Of course, that's a very established use. But it is also true that there's a sort of a more limited use where you mean something like, well, sometimes I came to believe something on the basis of some other thing that I believed. And the two beliefs in question stand in some kind of interesting, maybe logical, maybe causal relation or something. And that's what makes it an inference. It's that second, more restrictive notion that I kind of have in mind. So basically, if you operate with that kind of sort of more demanding notion of an inference, then it becomes quite plausible, actually, that the process of introspection is not an inferential process, because what that would entail is that when you come to know that you have a sort of pain in your foot, what happened is that you first knew something else, and then you inferred that from that, or that you first believed something else, and that picture just doesn't seem very plausible. That isn't to say that, there might not be inferential things going on. It might be that there are sort of there are computational processes or something that allow you to form this belief, and that those could be modeled as inferences in a more general sense. I have nothing at all to say against that. That seems fine. So it's really, when you say that it's non-inferential, you mean inference in quite a specific kind of sense. The same is true actually on the perceptual side. If you say that introspection is not perceptual, you've got to clarify what you mean when you say that it's not perceptual. And because, it obviously is perceptual in an incredibly impressionistic way of speaking, because, just as we said before, the very words suggest that it's kind of perceptual. And that's really what Shoemaker's contributions there are so important, because he did, in fact, specify what properties perception has, or in fact gave various, as he said, stereotypes of perception, and basically argued that introspection doesn't fit any of those stereotypes. So both when you say it's neither perceptual nor inferential, you really have in mind particular notions of introspection, of perception and inference, and the negative claim that introspection isn't that, are kind of presupposing those claims. Yeah. If you have much more expansive notions of perception and inference, then the whole topic doesn't sort of have the right shape.
Right. It might count as perceptual or inferential in some really broad sense, but then that's not, pointing that out is not going to really give you much information about the sort of thing that it is,
right?
Because it's so broad.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Yeah, and I did want to cover
perception is any way that you have of detecting information,
right?
And inference is any process that goes from one informational state to another. Then it's going to be pretty hard to argue that introspection is neither perceptual nor inferential, right? But if we understand it in a kind of more restricted sense, then it's much more plausible.
Yeah, and the specific labels, don't really matter for theorizing it. If you want to give more detail, maybe you'll just use a more specific or detailed label for talking about it, or just ambiguating it from other things.
I think it's pointless to be squabbling about how to use the word inference or how to use the word perception. The crucial thing is to say that introspection seems to have the following feature: you don't come to know it by inference by that notion of inference, and you don't come to know it by perception by that notion of perception. And then the question is, okay, so what is it? And that's pretty much the topic of the book.
Good. And you mentioned a few other things there. I do want to get to the Dretske's challenge because I found that interesting. But maybe first we should finish sort of building up to the principle itself. And you spend some time talking about consciousness and conscious states. And I was wondering if you might talk about that a little bit. Like, how important is getting clear on that for theorizing about introspection? And then, maybe what sort of view of conscious states do you come to favor?
Yeah, so I think it's actually incredibly important. And though it's curious that on the literature on introspection, and especially the literature on self-knowledge, which sort of overlaps it in complicated ways, the notion of consciousness doesn't figure quite as much as you might have thought, curiously. I find that slightly curious sociological fact. But on the face of it, consciousness is totally crucial, because when I said, okay, there's a distinctive way that you come to know that you're in, conscious states, the word conscious seems to be totally crucial, because I take it for granted that all of us are in, loads of psychological states that aren't conscious. And we can know that we're in them, presumably. I can know that suppose I unconsciously follow some complicated linguistic rule, let's say. I can learn by reading a linguistics journal or something that I follow that rule. And that means that I'm in some kind of unconscious psychological state. But that's not a matter of introspection or anything. There doesn't seem to be any distinctive way in which we come to know that we're in states that aren't conscious. So actually, while unconscious mental states are incredibly interesting and important, obviously they're super important for theorizing about psychology and the mind and so on, they're not particularly epistemologically interesting, because they don't seem to require any special kind of epistemology. We just come to know about them in the ordinary way that we do. We come to know about things, whatever that is. And so if the way in which I would come to know that I have a certain kind of I'm in a certain kind of unconscious psychological state, is pretty much the way I would come to know that you have one, or that some third party has one. So it's very important, but it isn't particularly epistemologically important. Whereas consciousness seems different. Consciousness seems to be, on the face of it, a case in which we have some sort of special way of coming to know it. We don't always use that special way, but we do. There is some special way on the face of it. And so consciousness seems to be completely crucial. So often people say things like, "Oh, there's some special way that we know that we believe things." You find that quite a lot in the literature. Inwardly, I think to myself, wait, is the belief conscious or is it not conscious? We have beliefs that aren't conscious. I take that for granted. Is there some special way that I find out that I have beliefs that aren't conscious? I don't think so. I'm not sure about that. But if it's a conscious belief, then yeah. So basically, what consciousness does is it sort of gives us a sort of restriction on the class of mental states, namely the conscious ones, and it then says for those, there's some distinctive way that we come to know them, namely introspection. And so that means that basically you can't really get very far without when talking about introspection, without talking about consciousness. Now, okay, at this point we face the daunting question of what on earth it is for a state to be conscious, and moreover, what of the many notions of consciousness that there are in the literature is the one in operation here. Now, here I kind of diverge a little bit from people in philosophy of mind who talk a lot about consciousness, because people in philosophy of mind who talk a lot about consciousness would be very quick at this point to say it's phenomenal consciousness that's important. That's the sort of the Nagel style notion. And the reason for that is phenomenal consciousness plays a massive role in a lot of questions that people are very interested in, like, for example, the mind-body problem. Phenomenal consciousness seems to present a major problem for materialism and so forth, which means that that's the notion that's at issue in the mind-body problem. But other notions of consciousness that are sort of knocking around, like more cognitive notions, like an access notion or a higher order thought notion or something, they don't seem to present any particular problem for materialism on the face of it. And so people are very interested in that. And that means that they tend to think that in other contexts, for example, when you're talking about introspection, that you should just operate with that notion too, because people might say, well, it's the philosophically interesting notion of consciousness. And so perhaps it's the philosophically interesting notion of consciousness, no matter what philosophical question about consciousness you happen to be interested in. I sort of realized sort of early on in the project that can't quite be the right thing to do, because while it's true that maybe phenomenally conscious states are such that we can come to know that we're in them by introspection, we can on the face of it, we can come to know that, for example, we have beliefs too by introspection. At least according to many philosophers, beliefs don't have phenomenal character, aren't associated with phenomenal character in the same way that, say, experiences or perceptual experiences or sensations or something like that. Now, of course, there are people who claim that beliefs do have phenomenal character, but that's a sort of somewhat of a minority opinion, I would say. And even if it were true, it's not something I particularly want to rely on early on in thinking about introspection. So I tend to adopt what Uriah Kriegel quite interestingly called mainstream stinginess about phenomenal character, which means something like it's experiences or perceptual experiences or emotions or something that mostly have mostly phenomenal consciousness, but beliefs aren't. And so basically I want a theory of introspection that somehow allows us to think that we can come to know by introspection that we have beliefs, which means beliefs have to be conscious just by the account of what introspection is. And that means we need some notion of consciousness that applies to beliefs as well. And so that's sort of quite an interesting issue for me, where I have to understand the notion of consciousness in a broad enough way that it can encompass both paradigmatic cases of phenomenal consciousness and also paradigmatic cases of states that aren't phenomenally conscious, but can be conscious in a sense, and in the sense that matters for introspection. So, at this point, I tend to be somewhat, first of all, I'm a bit of a pluralist about the notion of consciousness. I think when we speak about mental states as being conscious, there's a range of different properties we're attributing to mental states there. And we shouldn't be too kind of huffy about which one really deserves the name consciousness. There's lots of different properties. And as long as we know what we're talking about, we should be okay. Mostly in practice, I focus on a certain version of access consciousness, as Ned Block puts it. So it's really that when we think about states that are introspectable, states that you can come to know about by introspection, it's not so much the phenomenal states that matter, it's the access conscious states. Of course, phenomenal states can be access conscious, so I'm not at all opposed to phenomenally conscious states. It's just that fact doesn't make them introspectable. What makes them introspectable is that they're access conscious. And that, setting aside some exceptions, that's basically the position I operate with in the book. It turns out that Shoemaker operated with that same view, actually, so that there are a range of particular positions here that think that, are not at all unfriendly to phenomenal consciousness, and don't think that, agree that phenomenal consciousness raises lots of metaphysical questions, but they just want to say that when it comes to this other epistemological question, the notion of consciousness has to be adjusted. Otherwise, we run into problems about the epistemology of belief.
Good. Okay, so I had a couple questions about this. One worry that someone might have is that when you take this sort of pluralist account of consciousness and, well, it's not so, like, there's certain sorts of attributes that we associate with it, and maybe it has to have like enough of those to count as a conscious state or something like that. Doesn't that leave consciousness as something that's like potentially a little bit vague or indeterminate? Is that right? And if so, I mean, some people want to say that no, the consciousness is the sort of thing that just can't be vague. Like either you're conscious or you're not. So yeah, I wonder what you think about that worry.
Yeah, I'm interested in that worry. I don't go into that all that much. I don't discuss that at all in the book, but it is certainly an interesting worry, which is something I've thought quite a bit about. I mean, when people say that consciousness doesn't, it's a sort of an on-off notion or something. First of all, I think they have in mind phenomenal consciousness. They don't have in mind the other notions, because the other notions is just not very plausible. That they sort of have that property. And so that the pluralism I have in mind wouldn't be affected by the fact that one of the strands in consciousness has the property of being such that, it doesn't come in degree or something of that sort. So that's one thing to say, that even if that were true, even if that's true, and it's going to be true only of a certain kind certain kind of restriction on the notion of consciousness by my lights. And so if the others are perfectly legitimate, then that's fine. Of course, I mean, the field is a little bit fraught because a lot of people don't like the idea that, they not only say that phenomenal consciousness exists and it behaves in a certain way, but it's what consciousness is, and all of the other things aren't conscious, even though they're interesting in a certain kind of way. If people insisted on that, I have a little maneuver for getting around that problem as well in the book, which is roughly that, well, if you like that, we could, if you really think that, then what you could do if you wanted is operate with a sort of a slightly nearby definition of introspection, which doesn't actually rely on consciousness in the way that I was just saying, but relies on a slightly different property called being introspectable. So you could say, okay, there's the class of mental, before we were saying there's the class of mental states, most of them are unconscious, some of them are conscious. The conscious ones seem to require a special epistemology. You don't actually need to make that point using, the C word. If you're going to get into trouble with it, you could just say, okay, there's a class of mental states. Most of them aren't introspectable. Some of them are introspectable. And what is it for them to be introspectable? That is to be even potential targets of introspection. And you could have said that they have the properties associated with access consciousness or a range of different properties. And that would give you the same thing. It's just that you wouldn't be committed to the view that they're actually conscious states. So you can kind of maneuver around these problems rather than confronting them directly. I should say that I'm sort of somewhat partial on phenomenal consciousness itself. I'm not exactly convinced that it's a sort of a on-off kind of property. Andrew Lee has an interesting paper that shows, I think, fairly convincingly that it could easily be a property that comes in degree, even if it's a so-called minimal standard gradable, which means that if you even have just a very small, it comes in degree even to a minimal kind, then you get it. But nevertheless, that's different. And likewise, I actually think that, it may be that there are even indeterminate cases as well. So I'm not convinced really about the phenomenal consciousness case that it's kind of that phenomenal consciousness doesn't sort of behave like, warmth in a cup of tea or something, which clearly is a gradable thing. But I don't go into that in the book at all. I sort of maneuver around these issues rather than confronting them, as I said.
Yeah, good. It is a side issue, of course. But for the record, I actually am fairly open to the view that even phenomenal consciousness is something that can be graded or ambiguous or indeterminate in cases. It seems sort of implausible to me that there's we think of the following three transitions, and is there always a sharp transition from non-conscious to conscious, or by conscious I mean phenomenally conscious in all of them, over our evolutionary history? Is it really a first individual there that has phenomenal consciousness? I'm not sure. It feels more vague to me. Or even in our development, from conception, is there a first millisecond where we have phenomenal consciousness? Or even throughout the day, if we wake up from a dreamless sleep, is our first moment we have phenomenal consciousness? I'm not so sure. Maybe in some of those cases there is, but it seems plausible to me that it's not a sharp boundary. But some people find that very counterintuitive. But
I don't know. That counterintuitive. Yeah. I'm sort of with you. I'm much more skeptical about it, but I should also say that these, questions about what happened in our evolutionary history and so forth seem amazingly complex to me, and I wouldn't want to make any particularly quick assumptions about it. Certainly not a priori assumptions.
Right. Fair enough. And then the other thing about conscious states, I was just wondering, to what degree is this sort of neutral about theories of consciousness? Would it make any difference here if some sort of physicalism or dualism or something else were the case? Or is your account of conscious states meant to be kind of neutral on that?
Yeah, it's meant to be neutral. It doesn't discuss that topic particularly. I mean, when you use a phrase like theories of consciousness, that could mean various things. But if you mean something like, is consciousness compatible with a broadly materialist worldview, or is it not? Yeah, that topic doesn't enter into it. I'm interested in kind of what consciousness is, such that it is introspectable. but not so much what consciousness is such that it could exist in a physical world.
Yeah. You do later on in the book give an argument against illusionism. So, I mean, maybe we need at least that there is consciousness. I was wondering, maybe we could discuss that briefly now, and then turn to the rationality stuff. What do you could give an overview of your arguments against illusionism there?
Yeah, so actually, what I just said, that I said,
fine.
I'm not that interested in the mind-body issue. There is, of course, as you rightly point out, a little point in the book where I talk about illusionism, and illusionism is a contribution to the mind-body issue. So illusionists think, okay, actually, it's a little bit unclear what illusionists think, to be frank with you. But in any case, at least on a sort of very straightforward version of the view, it's first of all, a kind of eliminativism about consciousness. There just isn't consciousness in the relevant sense. Of course, illusionists will want to say that there are other notions, but certainly as far as phenomenal consciousness is concerned, there isn't such a thing. But nevertheless, we're under a sort of stable introspective illusion that we're conscious or that we're in conscious states, and that it's a stable introspective illusion, somewhat in the way that we can be under stable perceptual illusions. So, one might be the horizontal moon illusion, where the moon looks bigger on the horizon than it does at the apex, and so that's that's an illusion. Obviously, the moon doesn't change size, but nevertheless, that's how it appears to us, given our visual systems and the way that we interact with the physical world. And the illusionist wants to say something similar about introspection. So illusionism is a contribution to the mind-body issue, but it has a sort of, obviously connects to introspection, and so that's why I apply what I say to that particular case. The criticism of illusionism says something like, what I say is something like, well, if you think about it abstractly, what an illusionist must say is that there's a certain kind of property which meets three conditions. The first condition is that we must believe in introspection, that we instantiate the property, or perhaps more generally, that the property is instantiated. That's the first condition. Second condition is it must be that the property is not instantiated. Those two conditions mean that you're under a kind of introspective illusion, because an illusion means basically you believe that the property is instantiated and it's not instantiated. Those are the first two conditions. And the third condition says that the property in question plays a crucial role in the mind-body problem. And the reason for the third condition is that we all agree that we can, well, not everybody, I guess, but I certainly agree, and most of us agree that, you can believe in introspection, that some property is instantiated and it's not instantiated. So the possibility there's no problem with the possibility of an introspective illusion. But what the illusionist wants to say is that introspective illusion is going to interact with the way we should think about the mind-body problem. So the property in question has to play a crucial role. So those are the three features. So to summarize, an illusionist says that there's a property F which meets three conditions. First, we believe in introspection that the property is instantiated. Second, the property is not instantiated. And third, the property plays a crucial role in the mind-body problem. And what I argue is that there's basically no good candidate for such a property. And we can see that if we think about introspection in the way that I want to do. So, for example, what could that property be? Well, one thing is that you could think of it as a sort of a very ordinary kind of property, like just being in pain, being in a conscious state of that sort, perceiving a cat, and so forth. And if that's the property in question, then it is pretty plausible that we believe in introspection, that property is instantiated. And it's quite plausible, actually, that properties of that type play a role in the mind-body problem. But the issue is that now the second claim, that those properties are never instantiated, just seems crazy. The illusionist is now committed to the view that, like, nobody's in pain and nobody's ever perceived a cat. And that's actually not what illusionists typically want to say. They don't want to straight out say that. They want to say that it's not true that, of course people can feel pain in some ordinary sense and can perceive cats in some ordinary sense. That's not supposed to be the target from their point of view, which is fair enough. So that's what they say. So it's not that property. But then you could say, well, what about it being a much more kind of complicated, sophisticated property? So in the book, I use examples like being acquainted with a sense datum. So there's the famous sense datum theory, which, as a matter of intellectual history, it's quite interesting that kind of pretty much dominated certain periods of philosophical theorizing in the 20th century, and in fact earlier as well, and got some, there's a few people who still want to defend it now, though I suspect that they're not quite using the notion in the traditional way. But in any case, there's a theory like that, and it says when you feel a pain, you bear a specific kind of relation called acquaintance to a specific kind of thing called a sense datum, and those two notions, acquaintance and sense datum, are kind of understood in a highly theoretical way according to the theory. And just as a matter of fact, that's what you're doing. And I say, well, suppose we could think of the property like that, but now the property doesn't meet the conditions either. It's now pretty plausible, actually, that property isn't instantiated. The mere fact that the sense datum theorists tell you that there is such a property doesn't tell you that it's instantiated. But it doesn't seem to meet the other two conditions. It doesn't actually, I've sort of argued elsewhere that the mind-body problem doesn't presuppose technical notions of consciousness in that sense. It doesn't require a technical theory like the sense datum theory. So you can't kind of get around it by rejecting such theories. If that were true, the problem would be vastly less interesting than in fact it is. So I don't think that's true. But in a way, what's more important in this particular application is that it's also not true that you can tell by introspection that the sense datum theory is true. I sort of try to argue for that in the book, and basically, actually, sense datum theorists themselves will agree with that, because they think you need, a big argument, usually called the argument from hallucination, to establish this thing, this metaphysical claim about what it is to feel a pain in your foot. And they don't think that you can know it by introspection. So far as I can see, they're right about that. And so I think that introspection is in a way more minimal in the class of propositions that it allows you to come to know. It allows you to come to know that you're in pain or that you're perceiving a cat, but it doesn't allow you to come to know what the metaphysical structure is of those facts. And the sense datum theory is a thesis about that kind of metaphysical structure. So even if we suppose, in my view, counterfactually, that it's true, you couldn't come to know it by introspection. It's sort of analogous to, much more well-known points in the philosophy of perception, where you might, there's an issue in the philosophy of perception about whether you can perceive causation or perceive causal processes. Even people who think that you can perceive causal processes don't think that you can decide metaphysical questions about the nature of causation by looking. You have to, talk about arguments and so on. And so the sort of point is basically analogous to that. So to go back to illusionism, I said, well, the problem with any illusionist must think that there's some property that meets the three conditions. If you're thinking about ordinary properties like being in pain, they don't meet the three conditions. If you're thinking about really super sophisticated properties like being acquainted with a sense datum, they don't meet the conditions either, because you can't come to know by introspection that you're in them. So there just isn't, on the face of it, there's no property that meets the conditions that the illusionist lays down. That's the problem with illusionism.
Yeah, good. I found that interesting. I was thinking about how they might reply, like, for example, Frankish. What if he were to try to say, but maybe there's something in between that's neither super ordinary, like, I don't know, just a visual experience or something, or super kind of theory-laden, or even moderately theory-laden, like some sense datum theory. But maybe like, well, just phenomenality as such, I don't know. And maybe phenomenality is a property that's we might allege is pre-theoretically given in introspection, but also not instantiated and also crucial to the hard problem. Could that work? Or or do you think that's going to collapse into one of the other ones?
Yeah, it's a good suggestion, and I don't quite consider a reply of that sort in the book, actually, but I don't think actually it would work. There are people who are kind of skeptical about the nature of phenomenality. They're experimental philosophers who are skeptical about it, and I'm kind of open-minded about that. I think it wouldn't affect this particular line of reasoning for two reasons. One is, even if you're skeptical about that there's some sort of class of phenomenal states, like when philosophers talk about phenomenality, they typically think, there are pains and there are perceptions, and these things are grouped together and they're different from maybe beliefs or something. And maybe that kind of taxonomy isn't at all a natural one or something of that kind. Even if that's true, it wouldn't actually matter for the mind-body problem, because you could just pick examples and theorize in the light of those examples without being committed to a broad notion of phenomenality. And also, in the context of my own discussion of illusionism, what I'm interested in that chapter is, when we talk about introspection, you start off by saying, it's that distinctive way that I come to know that I'm in certain states. I come to know that I'm perceiving something or feeling something or something of that kind. And it's not the thesis that I come to know that the states that I'm in have certain properties. That's a different topic. So one question is, are you in the state? And another question is, does the state have some property F? And it's an interesting question whether you can come to know by introspection that states have some property F rather than being in them. And that's really the topic of the chapter. And I'm sort of a little, the discussion turns out to be a bit inconclusive, because I think in principle, if we come up with some property which it's really quite plausible that we know by introspection that the state has this property, then we could in fact adjust the theory I'm interested in to deal with that. So if there were such a property, I think we could accommodate it. The problem is coming up with such a property, coming up with a good candidate for such a property. And that's really quite a hard thing to do, because for some of the similar reasons that I just mentioned. So if the property is a sort of super theoretical property, it's just implausible that we're going to come to know by introspection that states have the property, even if they do. And if it's a property that we come to know, that we attribute to the state just by having the concept of the state, then maybe we could come to know it, but that's not going to be introspection either. And a third possibility is that we come to know that states have that property basically because we've assimilated a kind of implicit theory of some kind, or a folk psychological theory. And that's possible too, but that's not going to be a case of introspection in the sense that I have in mind either. And so basically there's just the story, the sort of message of that chapter is, if you can come up with some property that is really plausibly the case that you can know by introspection that some states have that property, then we can deal with it. But it's really difficult coming up with convincing candidates because there's so many confounds.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. So maybe part of the response here is that, okay, maybe there's another candidate, but let's see it. It's maybe not so easy to come up with something kind of in between. And if you say something like phenomenality, well, is there really something that's picking out there that's in between? Because is there something in between the kind of theoretically loaded notions? If I want to say metaphysically private, simple, non-physical, whatever, that's one notion. And on the other hand, I don't know, something more mundane or ordinary, as you say, I don't know, that we might just pick out by putting it to my experiences or something like that. Maybe something in between, something theory-laden and the, I don't know, diet quality or something. It's maybe more difficult to think of what that would be. But at the same time, there's been a lot of people who seem to think that that's just the intuitive notion, or that we take ourselves to have. I don't know. It seems...
Well, it could be an intuitive notion. Yeah. I mean, it could be part of folk psychology.
Yeah, maybe.
It could be that folk psychology gives you a taxonomy of mental states, and that they distinguish, amongst them, there's a certain class of mental states called the phenomenal ones. Now, it's an empirical question whether folk psychology does that. You might also think that folk psychology comes in different versions, and in, in a particular culture, for example, the culture of analytic philosophy, there's a kind of assimilated theory that basically does distinguish such a class of states. And then if you had that theory and you're in the state, then you're going to classify it in a certain way. All of those are possible, but they're not sort of introspection in the sense that I have in mind, because they're not really a distinctive way that you come to know that you're in the conscious state. It's just a matter of applying a theory. And I certainly think that happens, and that that often, often when we talk about introspection informally, we have that in mind. But I don't think it's introspection in the relevant kind of sense.
Yeah. That get me to thinking, and I do really want to turn to the rationality and getting a clear picture on the principle, but is, how to put this, is introspection ever sort of theory-laden in a way? I'm not sure if I'm expressing this the way I want to, but like, maybe sometimes could it make sense to say that when I'm introspecting on my experiences that I do sort of really introspect it as such, and then we say certain things about that might sound more theory-laden, not pre-theoretic, or is that building on top of the true introspection further inferences or further beliefs that we might have? I don't know if that made it.
So, it depends a bit on the theory that I have in mind. The kind of rationalist approach says pretty much that you ought to believe that you're in a state. If you're in the state, given certain background conditions, for example, that you have the concept of the state and that it matters to you whether you're in the state. Now, both of those further conditions could certainly be theory-laden in relevant ways. So, whether you have a concept might be influenced by what theories you got, and whether it matters to you that you're in a particular state might well be a function of what your background theories are. So, in that sense, the beliefs that you form by this method may well be influenced by your background theories. I don't want to deny that at all. So, I'm not saying that you couldn't possibly have introspection. It couldn't possibly have introspective beliefs that are driven in that way. But there's going to be limits on that, and I don't think you can come to know. For example, I don't think it's that plausible at all that you can come to know that you're acquainted with a sense datum or something, even if you are in that particular way.
Okay, good. So we should really cover the rationality and rationalism. So how are you thinking about rationality generally, and then I guess how do you apply that to introspection? You can maybe just lay out the principle, I suppose.
So I'm thinking about rationality as basically a matter of there are certain rationally permissible combinations of mental states that rational creatures are in, and there are rationally impermissible combinations of mental states that they're not in, and that there are principles setting out pretty much what these combinations are. So very obvious ones are things like, don't have contradictory beliefs, or at least don't have contradictory beliefs, not too obviously and not too often, or something of that kind. You can obviously qualify these principles in various ways. And a rational agent will therefore not have contradictory beliefs, or at least not too often. And we ordinary beings who can't be assumed by definition to be rational, insofar as we approximate what it is to be rational, we aren't going to have contradictory beliefs either. So that's a kind of constraint on what combination of beliefs you can have. And that's a kind of a very typical way of thinking about rationality. I'm interested in the idea that way of thinking about rationality is much broader than you would ordinarily imagine. So just as there's certain combinations of beliefs you shouldn't have, or should have in certain cases, we can also say that rational agents should not simply have certain combinations of beliefs, but they should coordinate beliefs and perception, let's say. So if you perceive something in front of you, then given certain background conditions, you should believe as a matter of rationality that the thing is in front of you. So that's not a question of the interaction of beliefs, it's a question of the interaction of perception and belief. And likewise, perhaps we could say that rationality involves coordination of beliefs and emotions, or coordination of belief and imagination. Of course, it also involves coordination of beliefs and desires and action and so forth. And so, generally speaking, I'm imagining a picture that says there are certain kinds of systems of systems of mental states which are such that a purely rational agent will be in, and there are certain systems of mental states that a purely rational agent will avoid, and the rest of us will approximate that, roughly speaking, insofar as we are rational, or at least close to being rational. So that's a kind of picture I sort of just take for granted in the book. You can also formulate that picture slightly differently. You can say, well, there are certain principles of rationality, and what rational agents do is like abide by those principles. And so in that sense, you've got this sort of structure that's kind of typical from theorizing about language, where you say, well, there are principles of the language we know, and what you do when you're competent with the language is abide by those principles. And that's a useful way to theorize, because you can sort of take a principle and kind of write it down on a whiteboard and wonder if it's plausible and see how to alter it and modify it and so forth to make it more plausible. Okay, so what I want to do in the book is to say, well, we can extend that notion of rationality to conscious states, just as other people have extended it to emotions or imagination or perception. So rationality isn't just a matter of not having contradictory beliefs or acting to satisfy your desires given your beliefs. Those are reasonably narrow ways of thinking about rationality. It's actually we have sort of much broader notions. And once we realize that, we can say, well, what is it, if it's true that rational agents have to coordinate beliefs and perceptions, what happens to a rational agent if some of their mental states are conscious? How does that affect what they should believe or what they should do? And what I want to say is that it's plausible to say that rational agents will respond to their conscious states in a particular way. Namely, if a rational agent is in a conscious state and it matters to them that they're in the state and they're able to form the belief that they're in the state, perhaps certain other things too, then they will believe that they're in the state. And forming that belief is a bit like a rational agent believing the obvious consequences of all their beliefs, or not having contradictory beliefs, or coordinating beliefs and perception. It's just a way of coordinating their beliefs with their conscious states. And then if you think that, so that's basically a kind of hypothesis. And then if you think that, you can kind of clarify what introspection is in terms of that. So you can say, okay, suppose it's true that rational agents have these capacities, and that we have these capacities too insofar as we are rational. Then we can think of an introspective belief as simply the outcome of such a disposition. So if you're disposed to believe that you're in a state, if you're in a conscious state, insofar as you're rational, then an introspective belief is just a belief that is the manifestation of that disposition. Moreover, if it's a manifestation of a rational disposition, then in an intuitive sense, it'll be a reasonable or rational belief. And if it's a belief that amounts to knowledge, then that's what introspective knowledge is. And so that's sort of broadly speaking the picture. And the reason I'm interested in that picture, I suppose, is that you can kind of see it as a kind of golden mean between two extremes. And basically, if you take that picture, then a lot of the other theories of introspection in philosophy that are knocking around can be organized by asking, well, do they accept something like that picture or do they reject it? Well, there are people who accept, or at least could be interpreted as accepting a picture like that. But then they go on to add certain things that seem to me to be, surplus to requirements. Basically, they might say, yeah, we can think about introspection in that way, but maybe you can only abide by this principle if you're really acquainted with your mental states, or something of that kind. And what I say about them is something like, yeah, you could combine the acquaintance proposal with the rationalist proposal, but there's just no reason to do so, because the general picture of rationality that I'm considering never once appeals to acquaintance. You don't need to be acquainted with your beliefs to abide by the principle, don't have contradictory beliefs. Sorry. And so likewise, to abide by the principle, believe that you're in a conscious state. If you are, you don't have to be acquainted with the conscious state. So that postulating acquaintance just looks like something that you don't really need to do, especially since it gets you into trouble theoretically on independent reasons. So basically, I tend to think of the acquaintance people and people in that general category as people who, for their theoretical purposes, could perfectly well accept with what I'm saying, but then add this extra thing that you basically don't need. And likewise, there's a whole class of people who don't accept the rationalist account. They accept something structurally like it. So maybe they think it's not really a rational principle that if you're in a conscious state, then you should believe that you are. Maybe it's just an empirical psychological law that by and large people who are in conscious states, given certain background conditions, will believe that they are. And that's all you really need to say. And for that kind of position, that's actually a version of an inner sense view that's sometimes called the broad perceptual model. That theory, the problem isn't so much the postulation of the psychological laws. Maybe there are laws of that kind. The problem is that doesn't really explain why the beliefs in question are justified, and it doesn't really explain certain kind of modal claims that we want to make, like that Shoemaker has a very famous one called the impossibility of self-blindness, which isn't explained on that much weaker position. And so the rationalist position is sort of a position which is in a way structurally like the broad perceptual model. It just says that the principles are rational, not empirical. And that allows you to say that the beliefs in question are justified, and it rules out the possibility of self-blindness. But you don't need to go on to add these problematic further elements like acquaintance and so on. So that's sort of broadly where I am. It's sort of you can think about the position as basically an application of a much broader view about rationality that's kind of in the literature anyway. It's not applied to consciousness, but there's no reason, so I can see that you can't apply it to consciousness. And once you do apply it to consciousness, you can articulate this view, which is, as I say, kind of hits from my point of view, hits a kind of theoretical sweet spot, because it's stronger than theories that and stronger than theories like the broad perceptual model, which run into pretty obvious problems. But it's weaker than theories like the acquaintance model, since it doesn't postulate some notion of acquaintance, which is actually very hard to pin down theoretically. So that's sort of broadly a picture of where I am on introspection.
Yeah, good. So one worry that someone might have is, well, should this really be counted as principle of rationality? Like, is rationality actually broad enough to include things like this? Because there are, you mentioned that, well, many of the classic examples include things like constraints about beliefs or relations between beliefs or things like that. But, you want to extend that to other things, that maybe relationship between beliefs or other attitudes and non-attitudes. But yeah, I mean, maybe can you comment on that? Like, why I think that rationality is broad enough that it might include things like this, and that this is a kind of natural candidate for a rational principle rather than a principle of another sort, if that makes sense.
Well, I guess it depends who the critic is. So it could be a person who thinks that rationality is really very narrow and just concerns, let's say, beliefs and intentions or something of that kind. And for that person, I tend to think, well, we have lots of examples in which it seems rational to respond to perception in certain ways, rational to respond to emotions, rational respond to imagination in certain ways. And so in that sense, it wouldn't be at all surprising if there are also ways in which it's rational for us to respond to our conscious states. So if it's the very narrow person, I would just basically first get them to think, well, isn't it plausible that we coordinate perception and belief? Isn't it plausible that we coordinate beliefs and emotions and so forth? And so that's one thing I would do. But of course, you could have another opponent that says, okay, I think that there are rational principles that are a little bit broader than just don't just concern the relation between beliefs or intentions, but also concern these other mental states. But why consciousness in particular? Why should it be a principle of this kind? And that's a position which I take seriously. And I want to say a couple of things. Well, one is I want to say, well, there aren't sort of silver bullets that establish that things are rational principles or not. Basically, you need to make a hypothesis that they are and see what happens to that hypothesis. And so in a certain sense, the whole book is a kind of attempt to answer this question. So it basically says, okay, humor me, let it be a rational principle. Let's see how far we can go. Turns out that we can go a hell of a long way, because we can kind of accommodate lots and lots and lots of philosophical puzzles that otherwise seem intractable if we make this assumption. But then there are also certain points in the book where arguments for the principle sort of distill in a particularly clear way. So one of them has to do with the thing I mentioned about Shoemaker's impossibility of self-blindness. So Shoemaker has this argument where he says, basically, it's impossible that we are self-blind in a relevant kind of sense. And self-blind means you don't form the belief that you're in a conscious state if you are. And what he has in mind is the following. Suppose that you're in a conscious state, you have an excruciating pain in your toe, for example. And suppose that you are perfectly rational and that it really matters to you whether you have a pain in your toe, and that you're perfectly capable of believing that you have a pain in your toe. It's not like you don't have the concepts or something. And suppose also that you've got absolutely no countervailing evidence that you don't have a pain in your toe. There's nothing like that going on. In that case, Shoemaker says, what should you believe? You should believe that you have a pain in your toe. In fact, he thinks it's metaphysically necessary that if all of those background conditions obtain, if you're rational and you have an excruciating pain in your toe and it matters to you and you're capable of believing, etc., then actually he thinks you will believe that you have a pain in your toe. And I generally think that's true, or at least something near to that is true. There's a few issues there, but basically let's just provisionally agree that that's true. One thing that's interesting about Shoemaker's proposal is that why he said that was true, and in fact necessarily true, he didn't give a terribly good explanation as to why it's true. And one explanation that you might have is by looking at the property of being rational and asking, what is it for a person to be rational? And what I say is, well, if to be rational is to abide by certain principles, that's a kind of general picture of rationality. And if among those principles is included the introspection principle, the principle that if you're in a mental state, then you should, then you've got a very, very straightforward explanation for that sort of self-blindness, the impossibility of self-blindness claim. So basically, you can that's an example of a quite direct argument for thinking that the introspection principle is a principle of rationality, because it provides a very good explanation for an impossibility claim that has been made independently without talking about the introspection principle at all. So I tend to think that, what is a rational principle and what isn't is, of course, a somewhat open theoretical question. I want to say this is a rational principle, first because making that assumption is incredibly fruitful, and second because there are quite distinct, quite specific, I should say, forms of reasoning that yield the fact that it's that it is a rational principle. That's the sort of line of argument I would try to use against someone who says, oh, well, I just don't think this is a rational principle.
Yeah, fair enough. And I mean, I think it would be too narrow in the normal sense to say that no, rationality or rational principles are only concerned with like relations between attitudes. Because even in other areas, like I was thinking about like in decision theory and rational action, well, we can talk about someone's action being rational, but that's not a relation merely between attitudes, because perhaps it's a relation between attitudes and behavior, right? And we can talk about the behavior being rational. So, already we have a case where plausibly in the normal sense, we have rationality extending beyond beliefs. It still seems a reasonable question whether it would include this exactly, but I think what you said there seems plausible enough. But yeah, someone could try to push back more, I guess. But
I mean, in the action case, I'm not opposed to people saying that actions are rational, of course, but often people say in that case that what's really rational there is the intention that produces the action. Notice that there is this view, like John Broome, whose views on rationality I haven't mentioned that at all, but I'm sort of influenced by here. One of his statements is, rationality supervenes on the mind. So that means that basically what determines whether you're rational are sort of mental states. Now, as he points out, that doesn't require any particular view about what mental states are, but it would rule out certain things. But if from that point of view too, consciousness makes a big difference to the mind, whether you've got conscious mental states or not. And so it wouldn't at all be surprising that consciousness has an impact on what it's rational for you to believe. And so that's a kind of another way of thinking that it actually isn't at all surprising that we would have rational principles involving conscious states, not just beliefs, intentions, and so forth.
Right, good. All right, I do want to cover some of the other things, including some of the other motivations for the introspection principle. But I said earlier we might come back to the Dretske challenge, so maybe we can cover that briefly, because there you had that paper from I think 2003 about where he basically argues against there being any sort of introspection. We know that we're not a zombie, but there's nothing that sort of tells us that we're conscious, and so there's not really anything as introspection as a rough first pass of the argument. But could you sort of expand on or explain how you understand this argument a bit more, and then your response to it?
Yeah, so I think Dretske's argument is a kind of super argument, really, and it's one that sort of, after I've set out the view, it's the first of what the structure of the book is basically. In the first 4 chapters, I kind of set out the view and compare it with some other views and so on. And then in the next 13 chapters, I sort of relentlessly go through various problems and sort of solve them. That's partly what I meant by saying, that judge the thesis by its fruits, because it turns out that it has a lot of fruits. But the Dretske thing is pretty much the first one I consider. So, Dretske says that there just can't be any such thing as introspective knowledge, because knowledge is something that relies on evidence. But in the case of introspection, you don't seem to have any evidence. And what he has in mind is something like this. Like, suppose I'm seeing my phone in front of me. I perceive my phone. And what Dretske says in that case is that, perceiving your phone gives you certain information about the phone. It tells you what color the phone is and what shape it is and where it is, and so forth. And then he says, but that information about the phone doesn't in any way render it plausible that you perceive the phone. And what he means by that, in part, is that the information about the phone that you have doesn't, first of all, entail that you perceive the phone. So that the phone could be sitting there with all of those properties, its shape, its color, its position, and so forth, without my perceiving it. So that clearly shows that the information that I get about the phone in perception doesn't tell me that I perceive it. But what Dretske also says is that that information about the phone doesn't even make it particularly likely that I perceive the phone. Like, if you told me about some arbitrary possible world that there was a phone in it with those properties, nobody would think it's particularly likely that I'm perceiving it or anything of the kind. So, as he says, what you're aware of in perception doesn't tell you that you are aware of it. Okay. And then he says, okay, but what about, take a case in which I do perceive a phone, and I'm somehow, I somehow know it by introspection. What he says is that, that means you don't know it by inference. You haven't inferred it from anything. You could have, perhaps, but you don't. So you don't do that. All you've got left is the perceptual state. But the perceptual state, as we've just noticed, doesn't tell you that you are perceiving it. So basically, it looks as if in introspection, if it's neither perceptual nor inferential, you have absolutely no evidence for the claim that you apparently know. And if that's true, you can't, as he says, you can't really know it. It's just because knowledge bears a constitutive connection to evidence of that sort. And so the whole notion of introspective knowledge from Dretske's point of view doesn't really make any sense. So you can think of this as, so he basically says, given a certain notion of evidence, it's conceded in cases of introspective knowledge that you don't have evidence. But you've got to have evidence if you know stuff, so therefore you can't really know it. Yet another way to put it might be, the concept of introspective knowledge is kind of incoherent, because the knowledge bit requires evidence and the introspective bit says that there's no evidence. And those two things together means you just can't have both. Yeah. So that's the sort of, in a way, the Dretske problem. You can formulate it in terms of premises and conclusions and so on, which I do in the book. But that's basically the intuitive problem. In order to solve it, what I do is I say something like, well, I think Dretske is operating with a sort of overly narrow view of what evidence consists in. So the way that he puts it is, there's nothing that tells me that I'm perceiving the phone. And that's what evidence is. It's something that tells me that I perceive the phone, which means something like, there's nothing I'm aware of. There's no proposition that I'm aware of that sort of makes the hypothesis that I'm perceiving a phone probable, or more probable than it would otherwise be. Or to put it another way, there's no proposition I'm aware of which confirms the hypothesis that I'm perceiving a phone. And what I say is that if the account that I mentioned is right, the sort of rationalist proposal is right, you actually don't need evidence in the sense that Dretske has in mind. Because suppose you are perceiving the phone, suppose you consciously do so that your perceiving of the phone is a conscious state. And suppose you abide by the principle we're talking about, the principle that says if you're in a conscious state, you should believe that you're in that state, given certain background conditions. Then if you abide by the principle, you will have a disposition to believe that you're perceiving a phone. And that disposition will be the manifestation of a rational disposition, and it'll in the usual case amount to knowledge. So you can come to know that you're perceiving a phone that way. But notice in that case, there needn't be any further proposition you're aware of which confirms what it is that you know. So basically, you can come to know it in a kind of non-evidential way if we have this picture available to us. And so we can basically deny Dretske's assumption that whenever you know something, you must have evidence. Now, of course, that sounds a bit crazy, because evidence can mean, well, the word evidence can move around. It can sometimes mean something quite narrow, which is what Dretske relies on in his reasoning. But it can also mean something like something that makes it the case that it's appropriate for you to believe the thing, in which case I don't deny that we have evidence. But if you mean evidence in the Dretske sense, then I think this view about introspection allows you to know something in a non-evidential way. And that's how you, I think, can respond to the argument.
Good. Yeah. So there does seem to be something plausible about the idea that, like, okay, we can, in a sense, know or have warrant for it, even if we don't have evidence for it in some stronger sense. But I think some people will push back and saying, like, but wait a minute. Are you saying it seems really weird to say that we just have no evidence that we're in these states, or at least no evidence by introspection that we're in these states? We have no evidence at all for that? That seems like the wrong result. Do you think there's a
like a crazy thing to say?
Yeah.
But I think the reason for that is because the word, you just need to be careful about the use of the word evidence.
Yeah.
So what Dretske means by evidence is a proposition you're aware of, which confirms what you know. So take a case in which, again, you have an excruciating pain in your toe. And suppose you come to believe and so know that you have a pain in your toe. Do you have any evidence for this fact? Well, in one sense, we're all going to say, yeah, you do. What is your evidence? That I have a pain in my toe, you might say, is your evidence. I'm not disagreeing with that. I think that's fine. That's just not the notion of evidence that Dretske has in mind. Because that you have a pain in your toe can't be a proposition that you are aware of, which confirms the thing that you want to know. Because to be aware of it is to have introspective knowledge of it, or something like that. And that's something what we're trying to explain. So he's not thinking about evidence in that sense. He's thinking about evidence in a different sense, of kind of in a way, a more propositionalist way of thinking about evidence, where it's some proposition that we're aware of, which confirms what we know. And in these kinds of cases, there's no evidence in that sense. That doesn't mean that there isn't evidence in some other sense. And often the word evidence shifts around, and lots of philosophers use evidence in the other sense. So what I do in the chapter is I draw a distinction between evidence and warrant. Evidence meaning the notion that Dretske has in mind, warrant meaning a much broader notion, which is basically there are facts that make it appropriate for you to believe these things. And it would be crazy, I think, to say that you can know something without having any warrant for it. But I don't say that. You have to have warrant. But it's not crazy, I think, to say that you can know things without having evidence in the Dretske sense of evidence. I mean, maybe another way to put that is you could put the point in terms of Williamson's notion of E equals K, because in Williamson's view, to have evidence is to know something. And so in the case in which you come to believe that you have a pain in your foot because you have a pain in your foot, to have evidence would mean you know something else, which then makes it the case that you come to know that you have a pain in your foot. But that seems like that isn't the right way of thinking about the situation. What is true is that you're having a pain in your foot, which is the important thing, not that you're knowing it. And so if you're thinking about evidence in the way that Dretske is, it's not that crazy to say that you can know things without having evidence. If you think about evidence just to mean this broader notion of warrant, then it would be crazy, but that isn't what we're saying.
Good. I did want to bring up as an aside, because previously I interviewed Susanna Siegel on her book, The Rationality of Perception, and I think you mentioned her work at some point in the book. Didn't make a note of it, but I recall coming past that. And so maybe just as a initial thing, do you think there's some connection there? Because I take it that you would have to disagree with her on certain key points about the rationality of perception, but or is this a sort of tangential issue on to this?
Yeah, it comes up for me because it comes up for me in the following kind of way. So sometimes obviously the position I'm interested in here, a rationalist position, is there are sort of versions of it knocking around, not quite in this version. There's the sort of Shoemaker version, which the thing that I have in mind is actually quite different. There's also a kind of version due to Richard Moran. He doesn't put it at all in the way that I've put it, but the position is kind of an allied position. But what Moran does is he sort of restricts it to states that, as I say in the book, are deliberative, which means states you can have reasons for being in and not being in. And what I say is that I want to apply it to conscious states in general, regardless of whether you can have reasons to be in them or not be in them. So, I sort of take it for granted pretty much that you can be in a conscious state of pain, but it's not. It wouldn't be appropriate to talk about reasons for being in the state or reasons not to be in the state or something of that kind. And so I take it for granted that there are conscious states which aren't deliberative. But I want to say that those states still fall within the scope of the theory, because the theory isn't in any way limited to deliberative states, because what we're really talking about are combinations of states that it's rational for you to be in. But those states, once we've got this broader notion of rationality, we're not really limited to states like states like belief and intention, which are deliberative. And we can expand it to other things. Now, I suppose the Siegel book you mentioned, in effect, says that, I can't remember actually if she puts it this way, but one way of reading what she's saying is to say that in some ways we can think of perception as more like belief than we ordinarily do think of it as. It can be subject to certain kind of influences. It can be assessed for rationality and so forth. And that might make you think that perception is a kind of deliberative state. And I don't make that assumption. I don't make the assumption that it's a deliberative state. But even if you made that assumption, I doubt it's the case that pretty much any state that's introspectable is deliberative. And so we're going to have to broaden it out that way. So that's how the connection to Susanna's book comes up for me. It's a very brief connection, but that's where it comes up.
Right. Good. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the exact details. I remember one of the key elements of that was that the perceptual experience itself can sort of be like epistemically praised or blamed in a certain way, depending on how it was developed or its source or something like that. Right. She gives examples with perceptions that are formed in part on the basis of, for example, racial beliefs, and those could be irrational perceptions in a sense. But yeah, I take it that
even if whether or not she's right about that, we can still. The point that for me is important is that you don't. You might have thought that to be a rationalist about introspection would require that conscious states can be accessible in that kind of way. And so if they're not accessible in that kind of way, then the theory would be in trouble. But I want to say that the rationalist account doesn't require that the states are accessible in that kind of way. What it requires is that conscious states are part of combinations of mental states that you're rationally required to be in. But that doesn't mean assessing them in the way that we would assess beliefs and so forth. I take it that what she's saying is that, contrary to what you might initially think, you can assess perceptual states somewhat in the way that we already assess beliefs as to, how they're formed and so forth, and whether they're rational to form and so forth. And the interesting thing about that hypothesis is that we don't normally think of perceptual states in that way. That's an interesting idea, but for me, it's not required that that's true to be a rationalist about introspection, because the concept of rationality is operating in a slightly different way.
Right, fair enough. But yeah, that's something that could be definitely explored further. Maybe we should talk a little bit about Acquaintance as a rival view, I guess. So on the Acquaintance account, roughly as I understand it, so being in phenomenally conscious state necessitates being acquainted with it, and then Acquaintance puts you in a position to form, certain justified beliefs. So something like that is our first pass. I mean, can you maybe expand on the Acquaintance view and how it's different from the rationalist approach that you favor, and then why you favor your approach over something like that?
Yeah, so as you say, the Acquaintance view sort of starts off with a theory about what conscious states are. It says that, first of all, they restrict themselves to phenomenally conscious states, as you pointed out. But then they say, well, for those states, they have the following kind of structure. If you're in them, you're acquainted with them, or acquainted with being in them in some versions. And that's completely different. If you're in some other kind of state, it doesn't follow that you're acquainted with them. So conscious states are essentially things that you're acquainted with on this kind of picture. And what you might say, well, that's a theory about conscious states. What's it got to do with introspection? The idea is that acquaintance is a relation that you bear to your conscious state that has certain kinds of epistemic upshots. So basically, if you are acquainted with your conscious states, then you're kind of in a position to believe that you're in the state because you're acquainted with it. For the Acquaintance view, the conscious state, as it were, considered on its own, doesn't put you in that position. It's really the acquaintance that does that, even though they're necessarily connected on the picture. And then, if you take advantage of the situation that you're in because you're acquainted with your conscious states and form the belief that you're in the state, then that belief will be justified and will amount to knowledge in the usual case, etc. So that's the kind of picture of the Acquaintance view. And what I say about that is that it's actually, formally speaking, it's kind of independent of the rationalist view. You could reject it and the rationalist view. You could hold the rationalist view and not that. You could hold the Acquaintance view and not the rationalist view. Or you could actually hold both together if you wanted to, because you could say, yeah, the rationalist view is correct. There are these rational principles, but they're basically in place because we're acquainted with the relevant states. Now, so then for me, the issue is the package I like, which is basically the rationalist view, which rejects the Acquaintance view, or any package that includes the Acquaintance view, what's the relevant plausibility of those packages? That's the way that I think about the issue. And I want to say that the Acquaintance view raises lots of problems which the rationalist view avoids. And there are two problems I talk about in the chapter, though, in the background of various other problems too. One problem is that just the restriction to phenomenally conscious states runs into the problem I mentioned earlier, that introspectable states seem to include states that aren't phenomenally conscious on the face of it, like beliefs. Or at any rate, we want a theory that applies to that. And that just cannot be true on this picture, because the acquaintance person doesn't think that mental states in general are acquaintables. They think that's a special feature of phenomenally conscious states. And so there's a sort of built-in limitation in the theory, which on the rationalist view is obviously not a limitation at all. It's kind of designed to be more general. So that's one kind of problem for the acquaintance view. Even if it were correct, it would only tell us about introspection of experiences and wouldn't tell us much about introspection of, let's say, beliefs, at least if we assume, as I mentioned before, mainstream stinginess with regard to beliefs. Now, of course, there are pushbacks against that. You could reject that view. You could try to analyze beliefs in terms of experiences. You could say that maybe we could have a hybrid view where you have acquaintance for the phenomenal case and some sort of other account for the non-phenomenal case. I have sort of responses to that, meaning usually they're of the form, well, if you want to, first of all, the definition of belief in terms of experiences doesn't seem to me to be plausible. But if you're going for a hybrid view, then why not go for a theory that accommodates all cases right from the beginning, basically? So that's one style of argument. And then another style of argument is that the acquaintance position looks as if it sort of violates a kind of plausible, ought implies can kind of principle. Basically, it says, because the acquaintance picture says acquaintance is necessarily connected to conscious states. You cannot have a conscious state such that you're not acquainted with it. So now we all agree that phenomenally conscious states are states that can obtain in extremely simple creatures that can, suffer but can't reason, for example. And for those creatures, they can be in these states. They must be acquainted with the states just by the theory. But if they're acquainted with the states and acquaintance has this epistemic upshot, then you can quite quickly get to the point that they really ought to believe that they're in the state. Why? Because pretty much if you're acquainted with the state, then you're in an epistemic position to believe that you're in the state, which means effectively you've got a good reason to believe that you're in the state. And they clearly have no countervailing reasons, because what could they possibly be? And so usually if you have a very good reason to do something and no reason against, then you really ought to do it. So it's true of them that they ought to do it. So it's true that they ought to believe it, but there's obviously no possibility of them doing so. That's the whole point of being a simple creature. And so these sorts of positions tend to run into those sorts of problems. The sort of rationalist approach that I like doesn't run into such problems, because simple creatures being simple don't abide by the rules at all. They can be in the mental states, but they don't abide by the rational principle. So they're just not in that kind of epistemic position. On the position I like, merely being in conscious states is in a way epistemically inert. What becomes interesting is when you're in the conscious state and you abide by the relevant principles. You need these two things together, and only then does something some epistemic magic happens. But it's not the case that we're assuming that the mere fact that you're in the conscious state, or in this case, the mere fact that you're in the conscious state and are acquainted with the state, which on the acquaintance picture are in a way two sides of the same coin anyway, because they're sort of necessarily yoked together. So that picture would have this consequence that you run into these sorts of problems. So those are some of the problems that I press. I mean, there are other problems as well. There are also problems on the other side about what possible arguments you could have for postulating this extra thing, because after all, you are postulating this thing which, what is this notion of acquaintance and what are our reasons for it? I'm extremely skeptical that there are actually any good arguments for it. So basically, I guess my attitude is roughly, if you're an acquaintance person who pretty much likes what I say but wants to add the acquaintance thing, then I sort of don't quite see the point of it. It kind of runs into all of these problems. There's no particular reason to postulate it. and it's just very difficult to argue for it. So that's sort of generally speaking my attitude about it. I mean, I have I know lots of people who are very committed acquaintance people, and I tend to want to say to them, yeah, if you like the rationalist account and you add that bit, well, okay, I can live with that, but I don't really see the point of it.
Yeah, good. And there's a lot that could be explored there. I maybe just a couple of quick things that came to mind when thinking about the simple creatures response. One is, well, what if someone were to say, actually, the normative consequence gets blocked precisely because it's just not something they could do, and because odd implies they can't do it, so they just don't have any obligation to do it, or something. They don't have a reason to do it, or at least something like that. Could that work, or does that not make sense?
Well, the thing is that if you said that they can't do it and therefore it can't be the case that they ought to,
right,
then somehow or other you must be saying either they're not in a conscious state, or that they're not acquainted with the state, or that acquaintance doesn't have the sort of epistemic role that it's supposed to play. And I guess none of those claims seem very plausible, and certainly don't seem very plausible from the point of view of the acquaintance person, because the idea that you can be in a conscious state and not be, you can be a creature that suffers, that doesn't reason, it's pretty hard to deny that. So then if you suffer, you must be in a conscious state. And by the theory itself, you must therefore be acquainted with the state. Now, you could say acquaintance plays a role, but it isn't sufficient by itself. There's various other things that need to be in place, like enabling conditions or something. And then I say, yeah, that could be true, but what are the enabling conditions? Maybe they're abiding by the rational principles, in which case we're back where we started.
Maybe you need to be able to be like responsive to reasons or something like that. Like I don't know. Maybe there's something else. I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but being responsive to reason sounds awfully like being rational. And then the question is, what does that mean? And we have a sort of a view about it. Also, the question is, to be responsive to reasons means you've got a reason. But according to me, merely being in the conscious state doesn't by itself give you a reason. What might give you a reason, or at least give you a warrant, to use the terminology we were talking before, is to be in the state plus abiding by the rule. But, so I think, yeah, you're right. These moves are available, but I think they detract a bit from what the acquaintance theory really wants to say.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. And then the other worry that I had about this was that, well, okay, maybe it's a cost of the acquaintance theory with the simple creatures, but like that it over attributes self-knowledge to them and so on. But what if there's a worry that your account maybe under attributes it to them? Because if or maybe not simple creatures per se, but other simple creatures and other animals that we might think are capable of introspection, but don't have the sort of complex capacities or commitments and so on that you on your account would be required for it. Yeah. So what do you make of this worry that your account sort of undergenerates or underattributes?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you might say, well, okay, maybe this theory, maybe the acquaintance people have a problem with simplicity, but maybe I have a problem with sophistication, and so I want to say that I guess I would say a couple of things about that. So first of all, I think that forming introspective beliefs is a reasonably sophisticated thing on anyone's view, because you have to form beliefs that you're in a certain kind of mental state, or at least be able to form such beliefs, and that means having certain concepts that obviously not all creatures are going to have. So that I think it's not that problematic to think that introspection involves a certain kind of sophistication, at least to that extent. Secondly, I would emphasize that the notion of rationality I have in mind isn't the kind of thing that sometimes people have in mind, which is, critical reflection on your situation or your mind or that kind of thing. That is not at all what I have in mind. What I have in mind is the idea that you basically a rational agent is built in a particular way, namely to be in a conscious state and then form the belief. It's got very little to do with what, their sort of kind of super sophisticated actions like critical reflection or anything like that. That's not the notion of rationality I have in mind. And then also there's no, particular insight into what sophistication you you need to be rational in that sense. The other thing I say is that I think some ways of speaking here sort of makes it sound like the capacity is more sophisticated than it is. So one thing I'm interested in, which I don't resolve in the book, is something like, well, if you're thinking about rationality as a matter of abiding by a principle, and that if you abide by the principle, that gives you a certain kind of disposition. One theoretical point of view says, well, the dispositions or the capacities are really the primary thing here, and the idea of there being this principle in the abstract, which you then bear a relation of abiding to. If that's true, it's just sort of an abstraction from the dispositions and capacities. That's one point of view. The other point of view is the reverse point of view that says, no, the primary thing are these principles which exist independently, and we abide by them, and then the dispositions are just things that happen if you do, in fact, abide by them. And I'm sort of studiously neutral about that in the book, but I do think this bears on the question you just asked, because the first way of thinking about it, I think, kind of unloads some of the apparent sophistication in the theory, because it says, well, all you really need is a certain kind of rational disposition to respond to the states that you're in, and that's all. There isn't that much sophistication that's required for that. Of course, there's some, but that's inevitable because we're talking about forming introspective beliefs. But it doesn't really need a lot of machinery. And if you think of it that way, then I think I don't particularly have a problem with sophistication.
Right. So part of the idea there is that it's not really all that much more sophisticated than you need to be able to form introspective beliefs in the first place. So maybe there's not much of a cost there in saying that. Yeah, that seems plausible. Okay, let's see. We're going to wrap up fairly soon. There's so much more in this book. A lot of other chapters that we really haven't touched on at all. But we only have so much time. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that I think people would be interested in exploring there. But I did want to bring up something. One of the, as you discussed, and I think you mentioned already, is that maybe the main motivation for this approach is to see how it gets applied to all these different cases and to observe the fruits of its application to those cases and see how it works. And also one of the benefits of it is that it seems to provide a kind of unified account of introspection. But I was wondering, like, to what degree is this right? So, like, it gets applied to, access consciousness, higher order consciousness, total states, and something comes up at one point, and so on. And I mean, as you say, those are all sort of consciousness in some sense, in like a pluralist sense, I suppose. But then, like, I might worry that it seems that the labeling is doing some unification work here. Do you see maybe you see what I'm getting at? Like, if we didn't group all these things under the common label, then we just have different accounts of introspection for these different phenomena, and so it wouldn't be a unified account. But that's a kind of syntactic difference or a semantic difference, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense? Or what do you think about this? That the unification is partly a product of the semantics.
Yeah, there's a worry here. I wouldn't quite put it by saying that the unification is a product of the semantics. What I would say is that there is a single principle that says, if you're in a conscious state, then believe that you are, given certain background conditions, etc., etc. And that simple principle is the thing that is in operation in all of the cases. What differs is that for different mental states, consciousness in that mental state might differ. So I'm sort of keen on that idea. So, for example, for states that have intentionality, that have content, then a certain kind of access consciousness is available, I think, because access consciousness, as I'm understanding it in the book, is sort of constitutively tied to that, because for a state to be access conscious, it must be that you somehow attend to the content of the state. So if a state doesn't have content, it can't actually be access conscious in the relevant sense. But there might be states, or at least processes, that aren't conscious in that sense. So one example I'm interested in is the case of inference, where drawing an inference doesn't seem to have intentionality in the right kind of way. What it is a relation between two states that have intentionality. So, for example, if you're thinking of an inference in the way we were thinking before, as a transition from one belief to another, each belief, of course, has content, but the process between the inference, that between the two belief states, that doesn't seem to have any content. And so it's actually a bit puzzling what it is for an inference to be conscious in the first place. It's if you assume that if you make the kind of mainstream stringy assumption I'm kind of making, at least methodologically, then it's a little bit hard to argue that there's some phenomenal character to inference. And if inference doesn't have intentionality in the way that beliefs and perceptions and imagination and so on does, then you can't you can't think of them as access conscious in the way that I was articulating that view. So it's actually a bit of a mystery as to what it is for an inference to be conscious. We do speak of inferences to being conscious, but we don't. Now, in the book, what I try to do is I say a kind of limited higher order account is plausible in that case. So inferences are conscious pretty much because we're conscious of performing them, which is what higher order people want to say in general. I don't go for the higher order theory as a general theory, but I do think it's plausible for certain kinds of states, particularly states that look a bit like actions, because actions are things that you intend to do. And if you intend to do them, then that allows you to be aware of them in a certain way. And if that awareness has certain kinds of properties, then perhaps we can allow that a kind of limited higher order theory is right. So if that's true, then it turns out that consciousness in an inference, for example, is a very different matter from consciousness in a belief. But even if that's correct, they can both fall within the scope of the introspection principle, because the introspection principle doesn't tell you what notion of consciousness you have in mind, apart from this very general one, which I set out earlier in the book, which would be satisfied by both inferences and beliefs. So another way to put it is consciousness is a somewhat abstract notion as it appears in the introspection principle, but there are different ways of realizing that abstract notion, and different mental states might realize it in a slightly different way. And so they're going to fall within the scope of the theory that way. And so what I want to do with that is to say something like, there's loads of people who think, well, you don't have a unified theory of introspection because, or you shouldn't have a theory of introspection that's unified because different mental states will prompt different theories of what it is to introspect them. Now, I want to resist that because I do have a unified theory. It's a theory that says, well, you abide by the introspection principle, but I want to somehow accommodate what they're saying by saying that what is true is that different mental states seem to be conscious in slightly different ways. And if that's the case, then we can accommodate this kind of issue. So if you're pluralist about consciousness, you can accommodate this thing without, at the same time as being a kind of monist about introspection, which is where I sort of end up being, basically. So it's a sort of like it's not exactly a semantic thing as if it were kind of just a labeling exercise. It's rather that there's a sort of there's a one that runs through the many, if you like. Introspection of inference and introspection of belief. The basic shape of the theory is exactly the same. The difference is that both the process of inference and the state of belief have to be conscious and introspectable. You have to abide by certain rational requirements in order to come to know that you're in these states by introspection. But what is true is that the process of inference and the state of belief, the consciousness in these things comes down to a different kind of property. So that's kind of where I am. And I guess you might think, well, is that labeling? Well, maybe. That's just, so far as I can see, that's where the facts are. And so that's just the way the world is.
Yeah, I think that seems fine enough. I mean, I don't know. I could maybe try to press it further, but because I could see someone, like if we didn't have this further term and just had the more specific terms like access consciousness and higher order consciousness and so on, and then you say, well, I can give a theory of introspection relative to each of those, and we end up with the slightly different theories here applied to different sorts of consciousness and so on. Well, then maybe we don't have a unified theory of introspection, but okay. Are things much better if we happen to have this term for consciousness that includes all those different things? I guess. I don't know. It's not clear to me that it's much different. That's just a difference in like what words we have. And so whether it turns out to be unified or disunified in that sense doesn't seem to make much of a difference to me. But I don't know if maybe that's just restating the initial way.
Well, I'm thinking, if someone said, is there a single thing that you mean by consciousness? No, I don't think there is a single thing I mean by consciousness. But the people who say that you need, people might say, but I guess the point, most people who think that you need lots of different theories of introspection, usually what they usually say is that different mental states are such that you need a different account of the introspection of those mental states. And I don't really want to say that. For any mental state at all, if you're conscious in this, as I call it in chapter 2, the inclusive sense, the one that includes both the notion of belief and inference, if you're conscious in that sense, then there's a completely unified account of what it is to for a state like that to be such that you can come to know it by introspection. So there's a sense in which we can capture a certain kind of generalization. It's true that the generalization gets realized differently in particular cases, but that's a pretty typical theoretical kind of situation. So I don't sort of regard this as sort of undermining the view that there are generalizations here that we can make.
Right, fair enough. All right, and then one more thing before we wrap up. I was just wondering what sort of areas of future development or research or might be sort of left open by your work here, because I mean, I think you mentioned maybe about whether the principle is basic or derived, but maybe some other things like that. Is there further things to build on or areas of research that you think this leaves open?
Well, the on the question of different questions that arise for this specific project, I sort of feel like since I've just finished this project, I kind of think, okay, I'll just let that lie fallow for a while and not worry too much about different things. But there are sort of related questions. I mean, one question is sort of related to what we were saying a minute ago, which is, what is it for a belief to be conscious, or what is it for an inference to be conscious, and so forth. And I'm quite interested in that, and I'm certainly interested in kind of questions about the relation between that and language. So for example, take the language case. There does seem to be some connection between consciousness in a belief and our ability to form a sentence, perhaps a sentence of an outer language or a sentence of inner speech that somehow makes you attend to the content of the belief state. So I'm very keen in this book on the notion of access consciousness that's connected to this idea that a state is access conscious insofar as you can attend to the content of the state. And often, as a matter of fact, the only way to do that is by attending to a sentence that expresses that or partially captures that content. And so that's the sort of thing which connection between consciousness and language is something that I'm very interested in and presumably will work on. That's not quite the same project as this project, but it's kind of related because it says something about it picks up on this idea that consciousness in many psychological states, though not in the case of inference, is a matter of attending to the content. And for linguistic creatures like us, there's really only, once you get past fairly simple cases, there's kind of one mechanism, which would, if that were true, it would mean that there's some sort of internal connection between consciousness and language, which I think is kind of ripe for investigation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, with all the things that are covered in this book, there's a lot of philosophically interesting topics that could be explored further as well. But yeah. And okay, so I do normally end with a kind of more general meta-philosophical question. So I wonder what you think is the value of philosophy. Why is philosophy worth doing? Do you think maybe in general or to you in particular? Or, I don't know. It's a kind of a broad question, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, philosophy is worth doing because the questions are so interesting. They're kind of probably the sort of basic philosophical questions are probably human universals insofar as pretty much everybody is interested in them, or at least can be brought to be interested in them. They seem to be inevitable side effects very often of any kind of inquiry into the world. So I think the questions are kind of inevitable for us psychologically. They're also extremely intricate and interesting in that sense. So that's why philosophy is worth doing. It's worth knowing about these questions which are inevitable for us. And I think that by itself makes philosophy worth doing. I think philosophy is worth doing for lots of other things too, because it has lots of downstream consequences if you can manage to think, if people can actually go through very complicated feats of reasoning in the case of philosophy, it can help them in all manner of ways. And so I think it's kind of obvious that philosophy is worth doing from that point of view. I don't think you need a kind of complicated theory of the value of knowledge or something to answer this question.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. The initial remark that the questions are interesting is, it seems to me, that alone seems to be enough for me. Like, I don't know, just figure out some of these questions.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's more to it that you could point out as well. But yeah, okay, that's been really great. So I'll include links to where people can find this book from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or WP. I think I'll check what links there are in the description. And there's a lot more in this book that we didn't cover. So there's definitely reason to check it out. But I think I'll throw other questions to it in there. But thanks so much for coming on, Professor Stoljar, and taking my questions and taking your time to have this conversation. It's been really, really great having you.
It was great to be here, Troy. Thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it.